February 24th, 1500, the eve of St. Matthias. Joy broke loose in the Netherlands on that frosty winter night as word spread from the palace at Ghent that a son had been born to the Archduke Philip and the Duchess Anna. 2 years earlier, the birth of his sister Eleanor had caused no such outburst of joy, and her christening had been a pale affair compared to the celebration for this newborn boy, who was heir to the duchy. The whole city of Ghent, the surrounding countryside, and the neighboring towns turned out and joined in a spectacular parade. There were bells, bonfires, minstrels, and mummers, and as it grew dark, fireworks from the tower of St. Nicholas lit up the sky. Philip and Juana watched them from a balcony of the palace, while the burghers danced all night in the streets in noisy celebration. The religious ceremony took place before midday in the church of St. John. A wooden platform 5 feet high had been built from the palace to the church, spanned by 39 triumphal arches and lighted by 10,000 torches. Houses along the way, which belonged to prosperous merchants and proud city fathers, were draped with crimson and purple velvet, each window filled with faces as the christening procession passed by. Hundreds of high dignitaries led the way, all carrying lighted torches. Knights of the Golden Fleece, members of the law courts, deans of the trade guilds, followed by a few high nobles, each one bearing a christening vessel made of gold. Then came the baby prince in a very long lace gown, carried by Madame Legrand, who had also held Philip at his christening, a far handsomer baby than this odd-looking little one. At the church door, 4 bishops and 9 abbots, in their high mitres, richly embroidered capes and stoles, were waiting to lead the way to the baptismal font. There, standing between Madame Legrand and Philip, was a young widow in deep mourning, Margaret. She had returned from Spain just in time to act as godmother for this newest member of the Hapsburg family, first grandson of the Emperor Maximilian. Charles was the name that had been chosen for him, the name of his great-grandfather Charles the Bold, the last native Duke of Burgundy to rule over the Netherlands. This newly christened Charles also bore the name of the first Holy Roman Emperor, Charlemagne, and 20 years later was to become the Emperor Charles. He was not only to be the most powerful ruler in Europe, but also the richest. As grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella, he was to become King of Spain, heir to all that immense wealth of the New World made available by the discovery of Christopher Columbus. For Isabella, far away in Granada, it was a sad thought that her crown and throne would eventually go to this little grandson born on the eve of St. Matthias. Although he was Juana's son, the queen thought of him as a Hapsburg and a foreigner. Little Michael, her other grandson, the frail baby Portuguese prince, Isabel's son, died the summer after Charles was born. "And so the lot falls," said Isabella, quietly accepting what happened, in the faith that, since it had been allowed to happen, it must be the will of God. Diego and Ferdinand Columbus, serving as pages to the Queen, found the year 1500 one of misery and humiliation, being continually pointed out and scoffed at as sons of that no-good admiral who had reduced Spanish gentlemen to poverty. Granada was full of discontented adventurers who had come back from Hispaniola, cursing Columbus. Ferdinand was to write of them in his book, saying, "I remember that when I was in Granada at the time of the death of Prince Michael, More than 50 of these shameless wretches, who claimed they had not been paid for many years past, bought a quantity of grapes and sat down to eat them in the court of the Alhambra, loudly proclaiming that their highnesses and the admiral had reduced them to that pitiful state by withholding their pay, adding many other insolent remarks. They were so shameless that if the Catholic king rode out, they would crowd about him, shouting, "Pay, pay!" And if my brother and I, who were pages to the queen, happened by, they followed us, crying, "There go the sons of the admiral of the mosquitoes, of him who discovered lands of vanity and illusion, the grave and ruin of Castilian gentlemen," adding so many other insults that we took care not to pass before them. All summer and fall, through months of scorn and ridicule, the boys held fast to the belief that what these shameless wretches said could not possibly be true. But in November came the awful news that their father had been brought home in chains like a common criminal. He was then in Seville, staying at the monastery with his friend, Father Gaspar Gorricchio, but still a prisoner. As soon as the Catholic sovereigns heard from Columbus and learned of his plight, they sent orders that he should be set at liberty at once and come to court, sending him 2,000 ducats. Just before Christmas, the boys saw their father, and also their 2 uncles who had come with the admiral to Granada. The 3 brothers presented themselves at once to the sovereigns in the famous audience hall of the Alhambra. Ferdinand and Isabella accepted the admiral's apologies and explanations. They assured him that his imprisonment by Bobadilla had not been according to their wishes or command. They promised that all his property, which had been confiscated, would be restored to him. Nothing, however, was said about where, when, or if he should make another voyage. At that time Columbus may not have felt well enough to care. But after resting in the Alhambra's sunny courts and gardens for several weeks, and being fully recuperated, he began to grow restless with the old longing to be on shipboard again. He saw himself starting out on what he truly believed would be the greatest voyage of his life. Still, not one word was mentioned by the sovereigns about his making any other voyage. Of course, they were very busy. As Columbus wrote Father Gaspar, they always seemed to have other things on their minds that shoved the matter most important to him into the background. The Queen was occupied with affairs of state, to which she devoted herself unceasingly day after day. Ferdinand, as usual, was busy with foreign affairs. Recent news from England was disturbing. Henry VII, it was said, now planned to have his son Arthur, Prince of Wales, marry Juan's young widow, Margaret of Austria, instead of Catalina. 12 years ago, when Henry VII had been insecure on his throne, he had been glad enough to make a marriage alliance with Ferdinand. Now, he evidently intended to slip out of it for a more valuable alliance with the Emperor Maximilian. Ferdinand, a past master himself at slipping through loopholes in a contract, had no idea of letting old Henry play that trick on him. Catalina, who was now 15, must be made ready and shipped off without delay on her wedding journey to England. Columbus was encouraged enough by this prospect to write Father Gaspar that he hoped, after the lady princess departed in the name of the Lord, something would be done about his voyage to the Indies. But there were still 2 years of waiting ahead before he could start that 4th journey, one on which he hoped not only to reach the Indies, but to sail on around the world. The hawthorn was in bloom in England. Bushes and trees were thick with foliage. It was spring, a radiant April morning of 1499. Across the river from London, two men were walking along a country road near Greenwich, deep in conversation. They were speaking in Latin, each listening with relish to the other's words. The older man was Erasmus. His companion was young Thomas More. They were on their way to Eltham Palace, where the royal children were living, all except Arthur, the Prince of Wales, who was now 13. He had his own court at Ludlow on the border of Wales. Erasmus had come to England as the guest of a pupil he had been teaching in Paris, young Lord Mountjoy, whose country house lay just behind the two men around a bend in the road. Erasmus had been delighted to leave Paris and come to England. The University of Paris had proved to be far from what he anticipated when he went there from Brussels. The dormitory was a filthy place with foul food, spoiled eggs, and squalid bedrooms full of fleas. And the teaching of theology was absurd. Serious discussions were carried on as to whether God could turn himself into an ox or donkey if he chose to, or if John the Baptist's head, after being cut off, could have been in more than one place at the same time. Becoming mentally and physically ill, Erasmus had left. To make a living then, he had begun taking pupils, hoping to save enough money to go to Italy. Meanwhile, by happy chance, Lord Mountjoy had invited him to come to England. And so here he was, and delighted to be here, delighted to be walking down the road with this charming young Englishman who could converse in perfect Latin, had a love and knowledge of classical literature, and such a rare sense of humor. Thomas More, then an attorney of 21, was soon to be admitted to the bar. He was later to be knighted, and still later to be beheaded by Henry VIII, now the 8-year-old Prince of York, whom he was taking his new friend Erasmus to visit. The young tutors in their household were assembled in the hall to greet their guest when they reached the palace. In the center of the group, acting as host, stood young Henry, who looked like an oversized cherub, with very fat round cheeks, blue eyes, pink and white skin, and a head of golden curls. On one side stood his sister Margaret, who was 10, and on the other side a pretty, lively 3-year-old, whose name was Mary. Thomas More saluted the prince, and then presented him with some writing or other. Erasmus felt embarrassed, having nothing to offer, but later sent a poem about England dedicated to Henry. In October, Erasmus was at Oxford. There he attended lectures on the meaning of the Bible that were so stimulating to him, so worthwhile, that he determined to make the serious study of the Bible the object of his life. The lecturer was a brilliant young priest by the name of John Colet, who was also a student of Plato. Colet urged Erasmus to teach the meaning of the Old Testament at Oxford. "Ah, no, my dear Colet, no. How should I teach that which I have not learned? You cannot get water from a stone." The first requirement, Erasmus felt, was to learn Greek in order to read the original text from which St. Jerome had made the Latin translation then in use. Erasmus knew well how many errors can arise in any translation, and that even St. Jerome might have made some mistakes. So, to prepare himself for what was to be his life's work, he determined to learn Greek. This he began to do shortly after his return to Paris, which was in December. At the time, he also began to compile a book of Latin quotations that was to make him famous. For this the King of England was indirectly responsible. According to an old law, reenacted by Henry VII, No English gold or silver could be taken from the country. At Dover, before Erasmus boarded the ship to cross the Channel, he was stripped of all he had by the customs officer. "And so," said he, "I was shipwrecked before I went to sea. Returning to Paris a poor man, I resolved to publish something as quickly as possible." Unfortunately, he was immediately laid low by an attack of fever, but while he was recovering, he reread his favorite authors. As he came upon so many wonderful quotations, it occurred to him that he might make a collection of them. "Why, in Plato alone," he exclaimed, "proverbs are scattered thick as little stars. What could be more useful for a gentleman with the average smattering of Latin than a handy little book of these adages or proverbs that he could draw on in making speeches or writing letters?" Adagia, Familiar Quotations from the Classics, was the title of this handbook, which appeared in 1500, dedicated to his former pupil, Lord Mountjoy. There were 800 quotations in the first edition, which was such an enormous success that even those who had not seen or read it knew the name of this now famous author. The serious study of Greek was also going along with furious intensity. In March 1500, Erasmus wrote a friend that "Greek is nearly killing me, but I have no time and no money to buy books or take a master. By lucky chance, I got some Greek books which I am stealthily copying day and night. I am determined that it is better to learn later than to be without knowledge. Afterwards, I shall devote myself entirely to the sacred learning after which my soul has been hankering for a long time. I am in fairly good health, so I shall have to strain every nerve this year." By fall of 1502, Erasmus declared that he could properly write all he wanted to in Greek. By that time, never happy to stay too long in one place, the restless author left Paris and went traveling about the Netherlands for a while, visiting various friends and patrons.